Good morning, all. Welcome. My name is Ren. I get to serve as your host today. Will you please take a moment while we are waiting for people to enter to put your name into chat? Let us know who you are, where you are, and your connection to the webinar topic. We will start in 5 minutes. Oh, I see some of my friends out there in the audience.
Hi, Gil.
Hey.
Good to see you.
Hold on, I don't see anyone right this minute. Hold on. Zoom. Ah, there we go. Hi, Eric. Great to see you. We
Good to see you too.
We haven't seen each other for a while.
Yeah.
Maybe we can stay on for a few minutes afterwards to just or some
Talk
other
about everyone. The joke. Jokes on Zoom are hard. Love to.
I got the joke. That's good.
I'm seeing people are letting me know that the chat is disabled, and we just checked that.
It's good that we know now.
Is annoying. We literally just checked that, didn't we? Let's see if we can do something here. Sorry about that, folks. I'm not exactly sure what happened. Well, I'm at a loss. You can certainly put it in the question and answer box. That does not seem to be disabled. Who you are, where are you from? All right. Welcome, welcome. My name again is Ren. I use they, she pronouns, and I serve as the co-director of the How Kids Learn Foundation and Temescal Associates, along with my colleague and founder, Sam Piha. So since the return of young people to school and after-school programs, after the COVID shutdowns, there have been major concerns raised by educators and youth workers regarding young people's mental health. Today, we're happy to have Dr. Gil Noam, developmental psychologist, associate professor at Harvard Medical School, and founder of Partnerships in Education and Resilience, or PEAR. Gil is going to discuss with us how mental health issues manifest in young people, who we should involve if we have concerns, and some strategies we can use to support young people. In addition, we are super grateful for panelist Eric Gurna, former president of LA's Best and currently nonprofit executive consultant, and Diana Carrillo, VP of Programs at ARC Experience, to engage in a conversation with Gil about his presentation and from the perspective of their work. I'm going to invite Gil and our panelists to give a more robust introduction about themselves when they first speak. So a preview of how this time will unfold. Gil is going to share some information with us. The panelists are going to respond, and then we'll have time for some question and answers. So you can please put your questions in the Q&A box, since it's the only one that's working. And as a reminder, we'll send you a link to this webinar and additional resources following the webinar. So now I'd love to turn it over to Gil. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Gil, will you?
Yes, I will. Can I just put up the slides?
Yeah.
Give me just 1 second. Okay, hold on. Okay, here it is. Okay, so can you see the slides?
We can.
Perfect. Yeah, so I'm Gil Gnome. I'm really delighted to join you, and thank you very much, Ren and Sam, for inviting me. We are longtime friends and colleagues and have really climbed many small and larger mountains together, and I look forward to many more to come. As mentioned before, I am, a faculty member at Harvard and one of its teaching hospitals, McLean, which is part of also Mass General and Brigham, for those of you who are in the Boston area. So a lot of training and research is performed in those settings. And my job is in part, I've been training many professionals, young professionals, psychiatrists, child psychiatrists, adolescent psychiatrists, clinical psychologists, social workers, but also in 15 years of ed school, med school combination, I've been very involved with the education field and have always been very interested in the two, mental health and schools. But then about 25 years ago, I realized suddenly that actually the connection between education and schooling, or education and mental health, should be focused on after school, a lot of it. And why? Because in many ways, after school is really a national kind of emergency focused approach of, prevention, support, and especially now during the COVID years and beyond, a place where actually a lot of mental health is being established, formed, supported because of the kind of youth development approach. And so for those 2 decades, I have become more and more involved in out of school time. And so that's for me like an extra special benefit of being with you today, because of kind of taking stock of how do we deal with the surge in mental health, and what is the role that after school, summers, OST, internationally often it's called extended education, what is the role? Those were also the programs that were often closed the first while schools were still struggling. We had to close down programs, but they were also kind of the first responders. Many times no one knew where the kids were, where the family was in the community, and schools were really struggling to find the students. And after school programs were able to do that. So it was really a time of really heroic effort by all educators, but the after school field should really get a special shout out. So that's my introduction. What would you like me to do after the introduction? Am I done?
We would love for you to continue letting us
Okay.
know what you want to tell us about mental health
Yeah.
and OST, Gil.
But do you want maybe the others to introduce themselves, or should they wait till they speak later?
I think they can wait till they speak later.
Okay, then we have something to look forward to. So I'm going to introduce you to a number of ideas and concepts. It's kind of a tour de force, and I would love to be interrupted at any time. So if anyone has a question or a comment, you can wait till the end, but you can also kind of let Ren know, and we will take a short break to kind of respond to some of your questions. So just a word about the organization that was mentioned. Was founded between the Harvard School of Education and Harvard Medical School, and is called PEAR, Partnerships in Education and Resiliency. And so we incubated for over a decade the ideas, the tools, the trainings at the interface of mental health and also program quality and professional development. So I will kind of give you a sense of how to access some of that. I will not make it a kind of advertisement for PEAR. What's important is that PEAR actually spun off 2 years ago and became its own organization. The work, I remained a faculty member and also continued a research program, which is called ISRI, because we couldn't have the two places with the same name, which is the Institute for the Study of Resiliency in Youth. And you will see why the term resiliency is so important. In the meantime, while I talked, you probably saw here the international presence, how many schools and out-of-school time programs we're kind of involved in, and that we're covering 49 of the 50 states, and we're actively, I'm going to fly to North Dakota and hand out a curriculum or two just so we can say we're in 50 states, because it bothers me that there's one state still as a holdout. I hope you know I'm kidding. So I think when we think about education and mental health, it's probably important to focus on the time that we live in. And I don't want to be an immediate downer, although I will be. I don't want to be, but we are really in a time when we step back, where we should tell ourselves, wow, we are really an adaptive species, and we're really doing quite amazing that we handle all these issues, the pandemic, the learning loss, which I'll get back to, a very significant mental health surge, school shootings that don't seem to ever disappear. And it's not just that the number of kids and teachers, that get killed. I mean, that's very disconcerting, but still, compared to the whole number of 11 million 55 million school-age children that, live in the United States, it's still a very small number. But what's not small is the anxiety each of these shootings produces for all children who go to school and for their parents who say goodbye to them in the morning. We are in the middle of a climate crisis, a very serious one, and have been for quite some time, and don't seem to be able to fully or even partially get on top of this. And for those of you who are in California, I can tell you that I'm concerned for you, what you're really facing with the storms right now. I have a son and a daughter-in-law who live in Mill Valley, just moved there, and live in one of those houses that have stilts and are built into the little mountain. So obviously there's a lot of concern on the climate crisis side of things, and it's very personal. We're entering a recession, most likely. That's scary. The whole inflation has been scary. The inflation rates, authoritarianism and racism. I don't have to, tell you much about this because you know it. You just had to watch the melodrama in Congress in the last couple of days where a small group of right-wing people, got access to kind of the control of Congress and now will shape things, even though they're really a very small minority. That's only like a little bit of the story. 1 year, it's only 1 year since the riots happened, the storming of the Capitol just happened in Brazil again. I mean, it's scary. And then last but not least, the war in Europe. I mean, we suddenly last February woke up to a totally unprovoked, unnecessary war, really unnecessary. And here we are 10 months later, or 11 months later, with so many people who have died, so many young people. You read the paper and you see, what, 20-year-old, 19-year-old from somewhere in Russia, from somewhere in Kiev, here they are, and, body bags, probably 100,000. So, how do we keep meaning? How do we actually, what does it really mean to have positive mental health under these conditions? A realistic person would be depressed. Maybe not clinically depressed, but depressed, feel worried, feel concerned, feel anxious. So that's, I think, the backdrop of what I'm talking about here, that we shouldn't be surprised that there is so much more mental health issues. And I want to show you some statistics that take some of this into account, but some of it is actually before this last set of crises that I'm mentioning. So 1 in 5 young people aged 6 to 17 have a mental health disorder each year. So what this means is a diagnosable disorder. Like if you take the diagnostic manual, the DSM-3, or by now it's actually way beyond 3, and you give them a kind of interview or you do a mental health evaluation, you will find that 1 in 5 experience a mental health disorder now. So not over their adolescence and not between 6 and 17, but at any given time, 1 in 5. We'll talk about whether these numbers are really correct for right this moment. 10% of youth, so over 2.5 million youth in the US, cope with severe major depression. So again, think about it, you're after school. So 1 in 5 have a mental health disorder. 10%, so every 10th kid in your program is experiencing a major depression. Not feeling sad, not being a little depressed, not being upset about something that happened in the family. No, depressed, major depression. In other words, for a significant amount of time, really feeling down, really suffering. 60% of youth with major depression do not receive any mental health treatment. That number has gone up dramatically in a good way. I mean, it used to be 80%, but now, 40%. The good news is 40% do get treatment, but 60% don't. And, to figure out who needs treatment and, from our perspective, kids who are suffering, but who are not clinically depressed also need support. And this is a especially problematic issue, which has to do with early detection. Typically, 11 years is the average delay between an onset of mental illness symptoms and treatment. 11 years. So you can actually, if you're in a school where, you get to know the kids well, a fourth grader who is showing symptoms can expect not to get treated or get intervention till way into high school, or at least high school, beyond middle school. So every year, that young little kid with so much potential is suffering a little more and is struggling a little more. And until that young person really ends up failing dramatically, which would get this person into a kind of special education track, or acts out, which means usually a boy who is really becoming a problem, a management problem, that child that is more internalized, usually a girl who suffers quietly and is quite anxious and quite shy and doesn't really speak up, doesn't get anything. So it's really, you have to really be out there in people's kind of face in order for the services to begin to kind of come in. Fortunately, I mean, the good news is things are getting better. So it's not quite as bad as it used to be. So people are more aware. I think COVID has created much more awareness in mental health and also special needs, and especially because many of the young people came back with a lot of externalizing issues. They were kind of being driven crazy by their isolation. If they came back and they were kind of anxious and quiet, they just adjusted and had to adjust. But if they were home and really angry and upset and frustrated, they came back with that anger. And I think many educators across the country and internationally are really reporting a lot more strife in schools and in after-school programs right now. Okay, so last statistic, 50% of all lifetime mental illness begins by the age of 14. So just remember that, because it means, and that's what I mentioned in my introduction of who I am, it means that after school is actually an amazing space to begin to do some work. Schools also, but I think schools are a little harder because there's, more structure, and that also leads often to kind of less interest in having deep relationships with students, because you have to get through the curriculum. And it's also not the philosophy of schools until recently. Fortunately, that's changing. The out-of-school time is built around a relational notion. It is built around the idea that young people need mentoring adults. If we take that out of the mix, we're nothing. We're just kind of housing kids, or we're just doing kind of cramming, like it often happens in Asia, where after school is a place where kids learn for the test and have to pay so that they do better at tests. That's not our model, fortunately. And because of that, we actually have a chance as a whole system, not just as individual therapists, but as a system, to begin to get to know the kids, to actually create some of the foundational work that works against mental illness. Because a lot of mental illness is not genetic and is not necessarily biological. A lot of it's social and psychological. So when you isolate a kid, or when a kid is bullied, or when there's a sense that, I don't have any friends, or my friends reject me, then of course you're going to have a larger number of kids who are beginning to get on this trajectory of pain. And that trajectory, unfortunately, kind of sets also the neurons and the brain in a certain direction. And the more chronic it gets, the harder it is to overcome. During the pandemic, I wrote a book, and I tried to speak out or speak up for what I saw. And I really thought a lot of the collapse of the education system during COVID, and I really feel that is what happened. No one was ready. No one was prepared for what was coming. We just did the best we could, but it certainly wasn't enough. But there was already an education crisis and a youth crisis before COVID. But the National Representative Sample Survey of Children's Health and Mental Health found already that about 16% of children in the US have at least one mental disorder. That's the statistic I showed you. But and this is what I wrote then, I believe that under our current extraordinary circumstances, and they're not over, the portion of students who will require targeted help and intervention could reach 25 to 33%. And I was actually trying to be conservative. And it is really now, with the studies that we have post-COVID, around 30% of young people who need significant support and intervention. I want to get back to that issue because one thing I want to instill in you already now, there is no health and mental health system that can handle 25 to 33% of young people who need intervention. I mean, we're kind of like in the British system that is kind of free, but you have to wait for years, to get some operation that's quite urgent or even necessary or important. So this is kind of where we are in this country. Therapists are full. Even if you pump in more social workers and more psychologists and more psychiatrists, it's still going to not be enough for individualized treatment for each of the people that need it. So we need to figure out other ways to do this work. And I'm not anti-therapy. I am a therapist also. I continue to love to see patients, clients, and I learn so much from them, and I hope I help them. I think I do. And it's a really amazing way to learn about the human mind and the soul, and also kind of stay open to change in oneself. But I don't think we can think that we ever will have enough people, even for the 20 or 16 to 20% before COVID, to really put everyone into individualized treatment. So I want to just briefly also go to the education side. So the average student lost 5 months of learning during the pandemic. Within school districts that were remote for most of 2021, high poverty schools experienced 50% more achievement loss than low poverty schools. So there was a big issue around equity. And I think, and I have data to support that the academic and the mental health, social emotional problems are really interwoven very deeply. So you can't have, really great mental health and bad outcomes, academic outcomes, or vice versa. You can, of course, conceptually, but typically they run in bundles. So the increased inequities during the pandemic has exacerbated existing inequities for youth of color, who have disproportionately suffered from inadequate resources and family risk and stress. So what we've gone through recently has actually exposed many of the things we knew before, but in times of crisis, it's become greater. Today, there's an article in the New York Times on the first page that says that recession is a real possibility, even though we are getting the inflation under control, but with the cost of possibly pushing the economy into recession. And what that will do is especially undermine the gains in African American and Hispanic communities that have benefited from a boom and from kind of a full job market. But we are about to see potentially, again, the push backwards that will hit not the rich and not the kind of half rich as much as it will those people who are already vulnerable now. Black children accounted for 20% of those who had lost a parent to COVID through early 21, despite making up only 14% of all children in the US. That's a terrible thing. Just put yourself for a moment into kind of the head of a young person who loses a parent during COVID. I mean, that's what China is going through right now. We have gotten this more under control. I don't know whether you saw some of the pictures of Shanghai right now, kind of people losing kind of loved ones. So we think we're out of the woods, but we kind of aren't. Boy, I feel like I'm depressed. I'm so depressive. I'm actually an optimistic person. And, I do like to think about COVID as something in the past. But what's not in the past is that, first of all my friends get COVID, my co-workers. So it doesn't seem to be over, but at least it's not as dangerous anymore. But it's also that we're really kind of only rebuilding from where we were only a short while ago. These losses only deepen the risk for traumatic grief, depression, and poor educational outcomes. So what I'm suggesting is we really, in our thinking, there are two realities here. One is that mental health is a problem for everyone, every community. It's actually in some ways an equalizer, which is very surprising because you would think that stress, let's say in urban environments, would create much more mental health disorder than, let's say, in a affluent place. And there's some of that. But what's more powerful is that actually the affluent settings will also show a great amount of mental health disorders. Parents that aren't around for their kids, that work, huge hours, eating disorders, kind of disorders of affluence that are really very serious, including anxiety and depression. It's more of an equalizer, mental health, than in the education realm. Because if you give me anyone, if you give a zip code, you can pretty much predict what the academic outcomes are of that zip code compared to other zip codes. You can't do that with mental health as easily because the rates are so high across the board. So now I want to go from this more abstract and general to something very concrete. I work with different places, different schools, different out-of-school time. We are a group, PEAR. We are about 20 people with a lot of extra consultants. So we are in many different schools and out-of-school time programs, as I showed you, in 49 states. So we gain a lot of experience. And Jasmine is one of those young people that we encountered. Obviously, I've changed the name, I changed some of the background, but in general, that's who she is. And you will know who I'm talking about because she's almost like an archetype. She loves animals and wants to be a veterinarian someday. So she actually has some educational aspirations. She spends a lot of time by herself reading or watching videos online, but is also constantly fidgeting. She tries hard to do well in school, and her teachers and after-school providers enjoy having her. She's in an after-school program that's in her middle school. She speaks her mind and isn't afraid to stand up when she thinks things are unfair. Jasmine has a hard time making friends, though, since she doesn't have patience to talk about things she's not interested in and will often interrupt or talk over others. She also has a hard time trusting other students and frequently thinks they're all being mean and unfair to her. So, when you work in after-school programs, in school, out of school, you encounter young woman like her. You encounter more boys who are like her, but you definitely encounter also a number of young girls. And you also, and this is important, you also can see how a diagnostic approach kind of can be helpful and shines through here. And if we could really interact with each other, if I would do a seminar with you, a workshop, which I would love to do, I would ask you right now, which I will anyway, but I can't really hear back from you, you know, what are the diagnoses? What does a clinician, not a youth worker and not a teacher, but a clinician, what would they hear or think about? And it's actually a complex case, because usually when you have a more, you know, angry or oppositional young person, you don't have as much of the love for animals and the future orientation and the kind of academic wish to do well. You often have like much more estrangement and frustration with the system. So give it a moment of thought and maybe write down something like first of all, what diagnostic, you know, stuff do you hear? And what should you be wondering about if you would be a consultant to an after-school program or the school and would want them to be both empathic, but also figure out what to do? And then maybe as a next step, try to think about what could be some of the activities you could do with her that would help her. But do first just a moment of thinking about, you know, what are some other kind of diagnostic areas. And I want to use it also to show you that diagnoses are useful, but I think are kind of not enough and get us stuck somewhere. But I just want to have some sense that you have. Do we have a way that people can actually write into? I know we don't have the chat, but is there another way that people can communicate?
Sure, people could, they could either raise their hand or they could type something in the question and answer box.
Okay. Well, then do this for a minute. And you know, in the clinical world, we have this term rule out. So there's some things in this text that tell you, well, this has a feel of something. But then there's also like, so what causes this? What causes the way that, you know, she feels things are so unfair? And, you know, you can say, well, because things are unfair, but she has a propensity to feel unfair. What are the rule outs? So, for example, is underneath her behavior maybe depression? Is it an set of anxiety problems, or other things that I don't want to give away? Okay, I'm going to move on while you do that and go to the next question. So, what strengths and challenges are present for this student? So this is where the assets comes in, not just the pathology, but what are the strengths? And what interventions would you try, let's say, as an after-school provider?
Gil, I just want to let you know that Jasmine, or that Moss responded that Jasmine sounds like she could be experiencing an intersection of autism and ADHD.
Okay, good. Yeah, I think the ADHD is really very present. Now, I can't exchange directly. The autism, I assume that's because she has a hard time with her peers and reading their cues and just kind of talking over them and not taking perspective on them, right? So those are two really great great ways of thinking about this. And often the autism spectrum siding can often be very light, is overlooked in educational settings. I think the ADHD reminds me of one of my sons who came, you know, he was with a lot of his friends, and they say, "Oh, David is having his ADD moment." So it's like this was when they were in high school. So they all had the ADD language by then, and they could even diagnose each other, or at least, you know, manage each other's kind of ADD moments. So question here, is anyone else kind of coming up with a comment about diagnoses?
That's the one that we have.
That's the one we have. Okay, the rule out in the case like this is always trauma. Is there trauma underneath it all? ADD doesn't mean it's a thing in itself. Often anxiety and trauma kind of are underlying it. So you would want to know something about that. And, you know, the whole kind of behavioral issue, which is maybe ADD related, but there's also a certain amount of kind of oppositional issues and fairness questions that are relevant to her. Now here, in terms of what to do, because I want to move us forward here, because I have a lot more on our menu, but I wanted to make it more concrete, is, so how would one support the building of boundaries? And what I mean with building of boundaries is that she can take turns, that she doesn't immediately jump in and says things over other kids and then is seen as impatient and kind of haughty. How can we tap into her purpose? She wants to become a veterinarian. I mean, that's a very long road and a very difficult road, but hey, we shouldn't underestimate her. She's not, her grades don't show it, but how can we actually, as an after-school program, say her love for animals and her love for her dog is something we have to build on. Our focus in the out-of-school time is to radically begin, no matter what the symptoms are, and no matter what psychopathology someone might have or struggle with, to believe in and commit ourselves to assets, to strengths. What are her strengths? What is her purpose? That's the only thing that's really interesting in the first place, because afterwards, once you have the alliance with the strengths, which is exactly what out-of-school time programs do, once you have the alliance with the strengths, you can actually repurpose the purpose and say, now let's figure out what it is that you need to know and do and be able to pursue as you want to become a veterinarian. You can actually start thinking with her, how can you bring interests in animals and pets into the out-of-school time? Even if you don't want to start like the whole messy thing of having a rabbit in your program, which, you know, I've seen, you know, many rabbits in the course of my visits in elementary school. Some work out really well, some are really hard for the teachers and the community, but you can do something like this with younger kids. But there are different ways, you know, field trips and other things you can do. And then the other thing is you need to empower a young person to negotiate, or through negotiation. You can't just say, you got to do what I want you to do, which is often what happens in schools and also often what happens in the home. But to empower a young person to say, well, what do you want? How would you like things to be differently here? I want to hear, we want to hear. We can't promise you we'll change everything, but we also need to be able to tell you certain things that you have to change. I just want you to know that those interventions are mental health interventions. They teach young people to adapt and to be successful, which is the youth development mental health approach. I want to create, and it's an ambitious goal, with many people in the field and colleagues, a youth development asset-based mental health approach. That is what we need, because if you are agreeing with me that the world is full of crises, then we have to reshape our idea of psychological adaptation or psychological problems and say, those are normal. What do you expect? If you have to stay for a year or 2 years in your home and you can't be out with your friends and you can't really have physical exercise and you often can't have to worry about your parents and your family members, of course you're going to have symptoms. And we should actually invite symptoms and not see the symptoms as our enemies. So if you take anything from my lecture here, it is that we have to create a new normality, a new normalcy, which is a state of symptomatology, not a state of being like in nirvana and everything is fine. Yeah, if you meditate for a long time, which I do, yes, you're going to get more serene, but you're still going to deal with things that are very difficult around you and also potentially in you. So I want to show you briefly what the foundation is for a positive mental health approach. And the approach we take, many of you know this because it's been around for a while. We created the Clover Model, and it has 4 different components. So it's an attempt to do the following. What I set out to do was a kind of document, create a document that is the antithesis to a symptom checklist. So we have, a diagnostic manual that includes over 200 diagnoses, very sharply defined, really quite strong. A lot of research has gone into it. But we don't have a real simple solution to the issue of thriving. What is a thriving young person? What does a thriving, resilient young person have? Only then, when we have that, can we actually organize schools and after-school programs to be a balance of these elements. And so what I'm showing you here is four dimensions. One is the physical self, active engagement, a really good, productive relationship to one's body. And by the way, this applies to all of you, all of us, adults as well. Second is a young person who has voice, can actually speak out, but can do so without harming others. So in other words, the girl we just talked about, she's in this assertive leave, but she has to both be supported to continue to be assertive, not to give that up, but also to do it in a pro-social way, which gets us to belonging, which is the relational self. And that relational self is highly important for anything that happens in after-school programs, especially, and we have to fight hard to make schools much more relational than they are right now. And finally, reflection, which is meaning-making, the cognitive self. So you have the physical self, the agentic self, the agency kind of self, the relational self, and the meaning-making cognitive self. When those are intact, they don't all have to be equal size because, different people have different personalities, but you can have one shrink to the point where it doesn't exist anymore. You really have to have those. And if any of you feel like, hey, that's not enough, I want more, by all means, add them in. Just don't call it Clover anymore because it's going to be more than 4. But you can put spirituality in there, you can put creativity in there. But my goal and my team's goal was to have the minimal amount of thriving elements with because each one of these needs assessment and training and PD, and we don't want to kind of overwhelm the system. It also so happens that this is a developmental framework because young people are much more focused on the kind of physical self, touching, experiencing the world through the physical. The middle childhood person is more competitive, more competency focused. The middle schooler is very much into the we go, the belonging. And the high school student is much more on the side of identity. Who am I? Where am I going? Okay, so you have this, but in contrast to some of my teachers like Eric Erickson and others, I don't want to see this just as a stepwise progression. At each age, you really are balancing and rebalancing and updating each one of these clovers. So, you know, they are also connected, to disorders. So if you use the language of disorder, too much active engagement, too much body is ADHD and impulse, too much assertiveness and voice is oppositional and child behavior disorders, too much belonging is kind of like guilt, attachment problems, separation anxiety, and too much reflection ends up being obsessive disorders, perfectionism, autistic behavior, Asperger, and just kind of existential despair. But I see that as outgrowths from the strength rather than we start with the weaknesses and then build kind of and say, oh, there's some strengths. Okay, so we have 8 minutes. So in those 8 minutes, I want to show you a couple of more things. I am convinced that with this idea that we will never have enough clinicians to deal with clinical issues, that we need to bring things upstream. So the mental health support has to be upstream. And fortunately, social and emotional development, as I call it, rather than socio-emotional learning, because I think the development part is very, very important, but includes learning, and engaged learning tied to school and life outcomes is important. So in other words, don't just pick out the mental health side and say, let's bring it upstream and make it more into resiliency and socio-emotional learning, while at the same time also accessing the mental health field when it's necessary. So I'm not suggesting kind of keeping cognitive behavior therapy or dialectical behavior therapy from young people who need it. So you will have me always as a strong advocate for more accessible interventions closer to where the kids live and closer to your programs, and maybe even inside the programs, like the Boys and Girls Clubs now have, you know, social workers in their clubs. I mean, that's really fantastic. But I think we need to also go upstream. And for this upstream, we have created something that is just off the press, so to speak, something we call developmental resiliency. And that is a way to go upstream. And it is part of what I'm talking about, the new normal. If the new normal is really addressing crisis, and I think the list of crises that I showed you, I think some of those things are here to stay. The fight for democracy, the threat of authoritarianism, racism, climate. I mean, those are not things that are going to go away very easily. And also the crisis, the chronic crisis of our education system that doesn't seem to be able to really create a learning environment for young people en masse that works. I mean, you have 20 years of data, of NAEP data, that is so depressing because it really doesn't change very much. No matter what you do, the billions of dollars under No Child Left Behind, they made an incremental small difference in reading and math scores, but not really, not a whole lot. I mean, given how much money was spent. So now we're in this phase of saying, no, you really need to have the whole child come back, and that will make the difference. Well, we'll see. I think it will, but it does mean that we have to really not just cram, but we have to create engaged environments where young people have a voice, where they feel they belong, and where they have meaning. And that's where I could say, well, you need Clover in every school, but I don't mean it like that. And I don't mean it as self-promoting. I really mean it as some basic kind of understanding of what thriving is and how you then create the environments where that's possible. Now, what I'm going to show you with resiliency is the following. The typical resiliency model is, when you look at it in the dictionary, is something called bouncing back. So the individual experiences hardship. I don't know if some of our graphic designer made it look like an atomic bomb. I don't think you need to be quite as dramatic. Anyway, you're pushed off your trajectory, off your pathway. You build new perspectives and skills, and you bounce forward. The typical way that people have talked about resiliency is you encounter hardship, you fall, like this person falls, and then you actually stand again. So you bounce back. But the model, why I call it developmental resiliency, is actually that in that process of falling, you have, with the right supports in the community, let's say after-school programs, you end up developing certain skills and perspectives that make you bounce forward. Now, in the trauma literature, people tend to call this post-traumatic growth. And this is like, I don't think you need trauma for this, but I believe that if we say, look, let's understand the adversity that everyone faces, let's accept that people will suffer and have, issues with that, but then let's use that power that they have inside of them and in their communities to build so they can actually develop. And that's the idea of developmental resiliency. I just want to show you, maybe I'll show it to you here. I mean, how we think about this. So there's a hardship experience, and it's often viewed through the body. The lack of constraints, lack of focus, impulsivity. So that's, in our case, Jasmine had some of that. The approach is to find physical outlets, behavior management, create structure, create practice. She needs, she needs containment that she can slowly internalize. And then the resiliency that gets formed is impulse and emotion control and self-management. So these are all a lot of words, but it shows you that you don't need a clinician to actually have that happen. You can just figure out what in your program do you have for kids like Jasmine that will help her not get more and more and more ADHD. You definitely want to see whether maybe medication would help her, but really even then, even if it would help her, she would still need a program where resiliency is built around the things that she encounters. And I'm not going to do this because of time. I'm not going to do this, but I want to end with the idea. So just so you're really clear, I think there's something between social and emotional development at the base and mental health services. And I think what's in between is the acknowledgement that people come in and out of sadness, isolation, sometimes even depression, fidgetiness, out of lots of the kind of symptoms that are available to us, that we often don't have to panic, but we have to actually guide the person to develop in the engagement with their isolation or with their sadness, to actually develop some strengths. So take almost any book that's being published these days, and you will see that it is a trauma story of the author who is actually, through the creative act of writing and letting the world know their suffering, is actually healing. And that's what I'm talking about. Many people will use therapists, obviously, to help them to get there. But I think young people, when they're in kind of environments, will do so differently. And I want to just show you what we use for that as an example are groups that we call the Clover groups. And those are 12 weeks. You can kind of use them in out of school time programs. You can, for example, for a child or a young person like Jasmine, you can have Ready, Set, Action, which is very physical. So that's very much on focus. Or you can use Photo Justice, which is all about fairness, where actually young people are getting cameras, throwaway cameras. And for a few weeks, they go through the community or their school or their after school program. They take pictures of things they find unfair. And then, rather than becoming angry and frustrated and isolated from their community, they actually become artists, and they actually help each other collaborate on pictures. There's an exhibition at the end where they get celebrated. And in addition to that, they learn some skills and they communicate about the issues of injustice. That has led us all these groups. I won't go into all of them, but there are 4 of them, each linked to an area of, mental health and education and socio-emotional learning. The word mental health never appears. The word resiliency does. And we have created advisories, both for schools and out of school time. So 24 sessions where young people are doing things that get them a taste of each one of these elements, with the idea that they should actually strengthen each one of these clovers, each one of these elements of thriving and resiliency, to kind of move into a stronger self and a developed or developing set of resiliencies. I will not talk right now about other things that are relevant here. Maybe they will come out in the discussion, but I want to stop here. And I hope I gave you both a kind of picture of the starkness of our times, but also I think of the hopefulness if you really take an approach that has development and resiliency linked together with a kind of North Star of what thriving really is. And I think I can tell you, even without any of the models and the things I showed you here, that I am convinced that what you do in the out of school time realm is actually resiliency building. And what I'm providing you is just more evidence and some tools that I think can strengthen that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gil. I wonder if you could just tell us what the other programs are in the other.
Sure.
Yeah.
So Ready, Set, Action is with the physical. You can see it there, kind of with turn taking and sports based, but you can do it inside. Strong Links, which is part of the relational Clover, is about creating resiliency through community. So these are boys and girls groups. They're separated because it's easier for them. And the idea is that they journal, they tell each other, certain situations in which they feel bullied, and a lot of exercises that have to do with them expressing themselves, but then simultaneously really sharing experiences, and through that, becoming stronger. And then the Our Stories is an intervention, also 12-week intervention that that's kind of digital storytelling or any other creative medium, which is focused on where do I come from? What's my community? What's my identity? So it's very focused on identity. So you can see it's like the first one is very focused on the body, physical, like in time and space, focusing anti-ADHD. The second one is kind of is fairness, morality, moral development, and agency, voice, pro-social voice, and through artistic experiences. The next one is relational, kind of connecting, and the last one is more, focused on identity. So
Yeah.
it really is very connected. And ideally, I mean, that's why we pulled it all together through the advisory, so that you don't have to choose between one or the other. We think about these groups as primarily tier 2. When you think about the pyramid, the three tiers. So kids who are not yet fully kind of clinical, but they need something kind of a little more specialized. And it really is only like, if you wouldn't tell people that this is about anything but youth development, it comes across as this is youth development, but it really is youth development with a mental health focus.
Thank you so much, Gil. I really appreciate your deep thought on how to support young people as we move through multiple crises. And I'm going to bring on our panelists.
Let me just stop sharing for now. I do have, if in the discussion we get into issues of measurement, because the whole question of how do you measure some of these things, so kind of is there anything one can use, or does it all have to be relational? I can bring that up later.
Great, thank you. So Diana and Eric, I'm not sure who would like to speak first, but whoever speaks first, if you could give us just a little bit more context about who you are in this work. And you are welcome to say whatever you want. A question to prompt you, though, might be, what is it about what Gil presented here resonated with you in particular today?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Diana Carrillo. I have been working in after school since 2004. I'm a product of after school, and I thought this was just such an important topic. I think especially now after the pandemic, we are seeing such an increase in the need for this for all of our students, and the age continues to get younger and younger. And so it's really, I think that's really the why for me and for many of my employees, really the why we continue to do what we do and why we strive to do better every single day, because we know that so many youth depend on us, and right, we get to help build and mold those young minds to really be the adults, the amazing adults that will, lead the world for the rest. I think that what really stuck for me was that resilience. But, in after school, we provide, we try to give them those resources, those tools to build that resilience, right? To help them stay grounded when these curveballs are thrown at them that will take them off their course. So we do that a lot in the after school world. For ARC, I'm the vice president of programs for ARC. And so we service K through 12. And so what we really do is we try to provide to the students different outlets. We try to help them build their skill sets, right, through yoga, Pilates, meditation, right? And then the younger ones, we try to get them to really learn how to express their feelings and to be okay with their feelings. I think that a lot of our students struggle with just the feelings, and they think that it's not okay to feel that way. And rather, we really try to teach them it's okay to have those feelings. You have to go through those feelings and just learn the tools and the right ways to really navigate them, to still be able to live a great life, to feel your best, and to feel that you have so many people behind you rooting for you that will support you and will help you stay safe throughout whatever situation you may encounter. So I think for me, that resilience, not just for my kids, but for my staff and for myself, we work with a lot of college students, and I think we've all been there, where school gets really tough, life is hard. And with that right team, with that right support system, and that great pep talk of, okay, great, like, have you, practice a little meditation, some, they almost like girls' night, right? A lot of things that can help you just release a lot of these things to build that resilience, to stay grounded, and to really just continue to embrace who you are.
Thank you so much, Diana. Eric, tell the people who you are.
Who am I? I don't know. Hi, everybody. I'm Eric Gurna. I am, I guess, in this context, who I am is the former president and CEO of LA's Best. But I've worked in after school since I was first at LA's Best in the 90s. And that was when I first met Gil back then. And what, I was really happy to join this today because it's so striking to me that the couple of years before COVID started in the beginning of 2020, LA's Best had been working on this initiative to strive to become trauma informed as an organization and to strive to become trauma informed as a program. And what that really means is embracing everything that Gil was just talking about and helping everyone who works with us to embrace it and to see the context that the struggles that children have exist in, right? That this behavior issue that we're having today is part of this whole human being's life, and that they have a lot that they've been going through that has been addressed or has not been addressed that's led them to this place, and to really be much more thoughtful about what trauma is, what trauma is that's passed from generation to generation, and community trauma, and what that leads to, and what healing can look like, and how those adverse childhood experiences can be the basis for our superpowers, which is how our former California Surgeon General, Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, put what Gil was just talking about with that slide, with that you get knocked down, you get up again. That's a song as well. But so we were working on that at LA's Best, and I just looked it up. We published an article on media.com in September of 2019, and so it was amazing when that hit, and it was like, oh, we've been collectively preparing ourselves to meet adversity with this kind of empowerment, and of course we were not anywhere near prepared for what we encountered. And I want to get back to that in just a second, because Gil, I was taking so many notes, and then so many of my notes almost became irrelevant because you sort of took a turn in your presentation. And part of what I was concerned about in the first half was, are we focusing too much on pathology here? And of course, in after school, we're all about asset-based approaches, and you really fleshed out how your approach, to with the Clover model and all of that, and taking a strength-based approach. But still, there was a phrase you said that was very striking to me, and I hear it phrased like this a lot. You said mental health is a problem for everyone. And what you were talking about was the fact that in more privileged communities and communities that are experiencing poverty, that they might all have the same levels of depression, anxiety, and all these other things. But really, it's not the mental health that's a problem for everyone, right? It's the lack of mental health support, or it's the anguish, it's the strife that we face as human beings that's common to all of us. And also mental health can be common to all of us. But we often talk about mental health as a problem, when actually the phrase mental health should be what we're striving for, right?
Good.
And what it makes me think about is how the whole system is based on a medical model of being reactive and intervention. And that even when, at LA's Best, in our partnership with Los Angeles Unified School District Mental Health, we were able to do a lot towards getting more interventions, getting more early detection, getting more collaboration with psychiatric social workers, but it still is about recognizing challenges and addressing them. And what I think what needs to shift, and what I heard you saying, Gil, is a shift towards prevention, right? Towards wide scale prevention. And I think that there's a model to look to for this that just goes widely ignored, that is, I think, one of the most functional health systems we have, which is dental care. You know, it's kind of incredible that we actually, many people, and I don't have any of the statistics, but many people, regardless of income, have preventative dental care, have regular screenings, x-rays, cleanings, whether you need it or like it or not. And whether you're someone who has to undergo root canals or orthodontia or all these like heavy interventions, the idea is every 6 months you go and you just get this check, and then you get more as needed. And my vision is to strive for mental health being exactly the same, that we all need it, that we can say, you know, oh, I'm leaving early today because I have a therapy appointment. And that's not a thing that makes us uncomfortable, you know, that's not, yeah, I used to do a thing in these workshops when we talked about the trauma-informed care. When we were in person, it works. It doesn't work on Zoom, but I'm going to describe it anyway. I would ask, I have a group of 50 people in the room, and I would ask, you know, raise your hand if you've seen a dentist in the past 6 months. And a bunch of people would raise their hand. Raise your hand if you've seen an eye doctor in the past year. And a bunch of people would raise their hand. And they'd start to see where I was going, and I wouldn't even do it. I wouldn't even ask the question, because I would feel so uncomfortable. I'd have to stop it right there. But I'd say, you see where I'm going, and you see how the energy shifted in the room, because everyone thinks that I'm about to say, raise your hand if you've seen a social worker or a mental health counselor or a therapist in the past 6 months. And it's uncomfortable even to ask it. I can even feel that uncomfortableness in me now when it's just a total hypothetical that I'm describing. And it's because culturally, we're just wired in with this antagonism towards mental health support, with this thing that means something's wrong with us, you know? And so I want to just put that out there as an idea for us all to consider, that we really need to shift our culture towards viewing mental health support the same way we view dental care. And now I want to shift gears for a second, because Gil, I have a question for you. And Diana, you set this up perfectly, and you're so much closer to this than I am, especially right now in your work at ARC. And shout out to ARC and all of the amazing programs and work that you do, because I'm a big admirer of your programs and have been for a long time. But Gil, I know you know this already. I'm not telling anything you don't know, but I want to acknowledge it for all of us here. The last few years have been incredibly stressful and traumatic for all of us. And I want to speak collectively. I want to acknowledge that I'm now even further removed, because I'm not CEO of LA's Best anymore, but I still want to say we, so forgive me. We who work in after-school programs and who are working with young people, we are just the kids that we're working with, we're just older. You know, it's like, Diana, you said you're a product of after school. Me too. Like, we're not any different from them, except that we've gotten the training and education and just age to be in this job. And, you know, I've been through my own very difficult experience with COVID. My wife has long COVID, still has it since March 2020. She got it at the very beginning, way pre-vaccines, pre-testing, and she still struggles with it every single day. Like, you probably read about this, right? So we're in COVID's not over for so many of us. So many of us have lost people. So many of us have, you know, been with family members who have lost their income. I mean, there's just been, it's endless, right? How we've been not observing this, but personally, not just affected, victims of it, you know, and personally still struggling from it. Many of us have been through the illness ourselves and have come out on the other side changed. And yet we're put in this position without any training to be social workers or any of that, with, even in the best case scenario, you work for ARC or LA's Best and you have some professional development, it is not nearly sufficient, even in best of times. And we're being asked to now be this pillar of strength and recognize the strengths in young people who are acting out in all kinds of really difficult ways with the behavior that we're seeing, you know, in very young kids that we used to see in middle school kids. Like, it's just, it's magnified. It was before COVID and it is now so much more. So Gil, how do we support our teams? How do we support each other? How do we keep ourselves in this work even when we ourselves are faced with such great challenges to our own mental health?
Wow, you really, both of you really came up with such interesting ideas, and I don't even know where to start. I mean, I will answer your question, but you know, what you saw in the two-part presentation, which starts with the more traditional view of psychopathology and ends with the kind of more mental hygiene. There was actually, in terms of your dental imagery, mental hygiene was a real thing, a real term kind of in the 40s and 50s. I think we have to acknowledge that the medical model, which I'm not a fan of, for sure not, I'm a developmentalist, and I think you can't be a medical model person, which is really much more categorical, and be truly a developmentalist believing in growth and transformation. You really, in the medical model, think much more about recovery, right? The kind of, you're happy when there's recovery and the symptoms abide. You don't have so much the expectation of what you call superpowers. I like that term, kind of ACEs that create the foundation for superpowers. You know, that's also the part that I love the notion of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, but I don't like the predictions that people then take from it and say, well, if you got 3 or 4 ACEs, you know, you're going to have a much higher probability to die early and to be alcoholic and to be divorced and all that stuff. Well, that's really not a theory that builds in resiliency, that the very people who encounter ACEs are not just passively enduring them, but over time and with the right supports can actually build strengths. And there is a strong kind of notion of self-righting that we all have inherent in us. But I also think that it's very important to recognize that we now have evidence-based therapies, and we really have also psychodynamic treatments for the last 100 years, where there just is a lot of knowledge of how to help people overcome, you know, panic attacks, deep depressions, you know, ADHD. So if tied to treatments, I don't mind as much that people have some knowledge about psychopathology. I still don't like the model, but in special education, especially, often the kind of medical model-like education categories don't lead to treatments that show any effect. Like, you take a kid who's like acting out in class, put them into a segregated classroom, usually racially segregated as well, and their outcomes are much worse than before they were actually put into those places. So that's the worst thing. You have a medical model that actually leads to bad outcomes or to no outcomes. So that's one thing. Now, in terms of the staff and we as adults, I think that what COVID has exposed is that the systems we live in are not made for us. I think that's what's exposed. I mean, that if you're a teacher who has a strong relationship with your children in the classroom, and you now have to interact with them over video, over Zoom, it's going to be hard, but it's possible. You still have that relationship. But if you had kind of so-so relationships in the first place, and you go on a virtual platform, it all collapses, which it did in most cases. I mean, kids just didn't show up or turned off their video when they really didn't have much of a relationship with each other or with the teacher. So there was that. And I think the same is true now. Many teachers are leaving the profession, many educators. I think what it has exposed is that these environments are not nurturing enough. They're not empowering enough. They lead to a certain kind of disenfranchisement. And that's what we have. And so part of it is individual. So resiliency is kind of often seen as an individual thing that a person has. But I think systems have to be resilient. And the only way they can be resilient is by opening up communication, by creating a sense of belonging among the staff, having a sense of you can fail. You don't have to show yourself as like this kind of superhero. And you don't have to be isolated. And we're so far away from having created that in general. I think we're making progress, but until we make progress, I think we're not going to really get to the human potential that this moment kind of both asks for, but has inherently as a possibility. I don't think that people come back with a sense of, I don't want to be part of this. I think they're coming back with a sense of, where do I fit? How can I make this work? How can I create a balance between my home, my family, my friends, and my work? And how can I feel empowered in my work? I know I'm shifting a third time. I first went from pathology to resiliency and now to kind of the system in the answer to you, but I prefer that than saying, I mean, we have workshops for educator wellness and mental health, and we love doing them and people really like them, but I think they are, you know, only as good as the system that actually invites us to support the teachers or the after-school providers.
You know, one of the things that I appreciated in what Gil presented is this notion that, in fact, youth workers are enough here. In fact, youth workers are critically important, and that when you move away from the medical model, what we see is actually young people need support in exactly where they are, exactly where their symptoms are, and that is the skill set of the youth worker. And you know, so many times we have youth workers really afraid when they're seeing behaviors, and this is a way to say, no, these behaviors are you, they belong to you. They belong to you, and you know exactly what to do to support young people in these times of crisis. So I appreciated that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I have a question for both of you. Eric, maybe first to you, because you brought it up about the dental analogy, which I think a lot about. You know, the equivalent would be that a clinical psychologist, social worker, or psychiatrist would have, you know, people working as assistants that would do the more preventative work. Where this break, and it makes total sense. It's actually even economically. I mean, dentists, there's a reason why dentists make so much money, right? Because they've worked it out. It's really helpful as a public health system, but it's also like, if you can make, you know, all these people who are coming in for preventative time, and you don't have to do this as a dentist, but someone you employ, boy, you can make a lot of money. So there is actually, in this prevention, where often people say there's no money, there is actually money. But I mean, I've thought about it, like, for example, for couples, you get married or you come together, and wouldn't it be great every year that they could come to talk to someone and kind of talk things out, like, how are you doing? But it's a little awkward, right? It's like with a dental appointment, it's a little clearer what you're doing, right? So I'm supposed to come and do what exactly here every 6 months? So I just wonder whether you have some thoughts about, because the idea and the structure makes sense, but the implementation is a little hard.
I mean, I think it's all what we're used to. It's a little awkward to walk into an office, lie down in a chair, and have someone stick their fingers in your mouth. Like that's just as awkward. It's just we're used to it because ever since I was little, that's been a thing that I do, and so I'm used to it. And I trust the people who are there, and I know they're going to be safe about it. They're competent. They know what they're doing. And it's, when I've had problems, they've been able to fix them over time, right? So I trust it, and I see that it has impact. So I think that, I love what you said about the equivalent of the dental hygienist, that's a profession that maybe doesn't exist right now, or maybe it does. Maybe there's an equivalent, and I'm just not as familiar.
Not really.
But it's awkward. Therapy is awkward. It's awkward to go and talk about your daily struggles. It's awkward to go and talk about your childhood trauma. It's awkward to talk about your relationships, your relationship with your romantic partner, or your relationship with your coworkers. It's awkward to talk about your dreams and what they mean. It's all awkward. And just like, our work can be awkward. Getting a group of, 28th graders in a circle and saying, we're going to talk about our feelings is awkward. And we get, as youth workers, we get a little made fun of by the kids for it. It's corny, but then they get used to it. And especially when you start having these rituals and routines where you have a talking stick that you pass around, and people talk about, people use all kinds of different methods, colors and weather and everything to talk about their feelings, it becomes less awkward. It becomes natural. It becomes expected and part of what we do. It makes me think also about the lack of creative support and arts education in our schools. And so it's awkward to sit down and be asked to draw something because we're not used to it. But I'm lucky enough to be married to an artist, and my kids are it's second nature to them to draw and paint and make stuff. And so it's not awkward for them anymore, or it never was. And for me, I grew up without any of that. And so it feels incredibly awkward to do it. So I think that's a really good point. And it's a great word that I keep saying over and over again, awkward, that you said, because that's just something we can get over. But what it points to is the cultural attitudes that need to shift, because the awkwardness only exists because of the cultural attitudes. And we all think, not all, I shouldn't say we all, many people think that a resistance to mental health support is specific to their own cultural background. People say, oh, we don't do that. That's not, there's a machismo about it in some cases. And I've heard so many different people from so many different parts of the world and cultural backgrounds in America speak to it as though it's owned there, but it's almost universal that's true, and I think that something I think don't talk about enough because it's so big picture is that we need to change the culture.
Yeah. Diana, you look like you're going to say something.
I completely agree. I think that, I like the example that you gave, Eric, right, where you did in the training or whatnot, like, okay, how many times have you seen the dentist, the eye doctor and whatnot? And I think that awkward feeling of like, have you seen a therapist? Have you any type of mental health, that you may have seen? It's that awkward feeling, but I think it's because we also struggle in just embracing that going to a therapist doesn't mean something is wrong with you, right? Going to a therapist is that maintaining of that balance, that groundedness, that self-love, that, and I think that when the pandemic hit, my CEO, Brad Lupian, his message to everyone was, we are leading with the heart. We are leading with the heart because everything was so, right? We didn't know what was going to happen. And so we pushed the message, we are leading with the heart, we are leading with the heart. Until today, that is the message that, we are pushing out. And we are still making strides to that. We are very far from reaching what we'd love to, the impact we'd like to make. But I think that has changed the approach that we have with our staff, with our students, and with each other, right? And being able to just own it and say, you know what, I had a really rough day and I had to take a couple of minutes and just get myself grounded back, or, today is just not a good day. So today may not be a great day to have a meeting for me, right? And I think that when we ourselves make ourselves human, and we are human with our staff and with our kids, then we become relatable and we become a safe zone for each other. And, you know, I have staff where I have site coordinators where I'm on hugging terms with site coordinators, not all, right, but some. But then when I take a step back and I realize, like, well, I've spent more time with a specific site coordinator and they know how many dogs I have, and they know that, you know, coffee is my love language type of thing, right? So I think that when we become human and we own our flaws and really able to say, like, really, those aren't my flaws, those are my strengths, because that is why I am who I am. That is why I am resilient. And that is why I am exactly where I am meant to be. And really pushing that message for our staff so that then that trickles down to our kids. I think that that just, you know, kind of creates that little image, you know, I'm sure we've all seen it where it's like that little circle and all the little stick figures are holding hands. You know, it almost creates that like kumbaya moment for all of us. So, you know, I think just not seeing as mental health as something's wrong with you. And that's why you need mental health resources or whatnot.
Dan, I think I just want to underline what you just said, because like, I think that showing that humanity and that vulnerability is something that, well, I think a lot of us have talked about it a lot in after school for many, many years. What we mostly draw from is our own experience as students in the school system, where most of our teachers were pretty buttoned up, you know, and pretty like best face forward or strongest, strictest face forward. But it was leading with confidence, leading with authority, you know, and, you know, people always talk about like that moment when you see your teacher at the grocery store and you think, oh my gosh, they have a life outside. And I think part of that is that it's this, you know, this mask kind of that we hold up, and that when we can share our own vulnerabilities, we invite young people to be more comfortable with theirs. And I also want to say that there's a real balancing act that has to happen, because sometimes if things are too raw, next thing you know, you're weeping in a group because you're in the middle of some real struggles in your life. And you don't have the option to say, now's not a good moment for me, because we have staffing shortages and no one else can be in ratio. So I think that there's this real balance of doing what you just said and also doing what Gil was saying about like, how do I do my breathing exercises to get past this moment, deal with this later, so that I can be grounded and present in this moment for my group, you know. And I anyone who is on this webinar who's with young people every day or in sites, in programs in schools every day, like, I just want to express my appreciation to you for the past few years, especially because I've had plenty of moments where it's hard for me to keep myself together on a Zoom, you know, and on a Zoom, you know, you can click mute, turn off video, and, you know, it's an invisibility cloak. You've disappeared, and you don't have that when you're with your group or when you're with your staff. And it takes a lot of strength and it takes a lot of resilience. And so I just want to express my appreciation to everybody and all of your colleagues, because it's just been an incredibly challenging time.
I wonder, by the way, do we have any comments or questions from the group? Because while you're looking, I can just make a comment, but
not just yet. And I was going to open it up to any of the attendees. If you'd like to come off mic, just raise your hand and I can bring you on, or you're welcome to post something in the a question or a comment in the question and answer box.
yeah, I think we're talking at a number of different levels, and in fact, which makes it so rich. And in fact, the multi-tiered system is a pretty good way of organizing some of the things we're talking about, because we are talking both at tier 3, where you have like significant issues, and Eric, you're really sharing those with us, And I just want to thank you for that, because that takes courage, and you just really are right in front of us, normalizing kind of all the things that you described in your family and in your surrounding. And there, I think that, to your point, I think for that tier 3, like real problems, real strain, real potential knowledge of that there's help out there, kind of the dentist analogy for psychotherapy and counseling. I see a very big cultural shift towards acceptance of that through the media, through almost like in some of the communities, like, well, who's your therapist? And just as an example, I think in the college space and university space, there is such a run on the counseling center that people, where it's become really almost the norm. You know, you go there, actually the levels of Prozac, it's almost like in the drinking water in the dormitories, the amount of kids who are or students and faculty who are on antidepressants, on SSRIs, is amazing. I know a statistic from Harvard, which was, I mean, who knows whether it's correct, but it was, I think, 25% to 30% who are on medication. But then the other part is once you have everyone, like the stigma is kind of half gone. Everyone wants it. Why wouldn't you want a therapist, especially if the insurance pays for it? I mean, when you really put the shame away, and that kind of goes away pretty fast once you're really in a relationship with someone, and someone listens to you and is insightful and is empathic, man, why not? I mean, this would be, you're leaving some services to others when in fact they would be very helpful to you, right? So then what we get is a situation where we just don't have enough people who can do this, right? Because for that, you need the dentist. You don't need anyone who's doing prevention. You need really people who've been skilled and trained to deal with all the stuff that comes out in the dreams and what you said, the childhood trauma, etc. And I think that's why I proposed to go upstream at the same time. In other words, if there's an avalanche there, and if we really address this earlier, then we have a chance, and not let it slide for those 10, 11 years that I mentioned, where actually people become chronically kind of connected to their symptoms, but really address things early, which then gets us to Diana's point, which is, that's not therapy. What you're describing is a different way in which we allow for our emotions to, in our hearts, to kind of be in our workplace. Very risky. Like you said, you described. I mean, there's a reason why there was such a wall against that, because once you open it up, it's much better, but it has to be managed, including like relationships between adults and kids. When you have really an environment with lots of really fluid, positive relationships. You know, I wrote a book with Beth Bernstein, who's in LA, about this very topic. You know, how do you actually negotiate the boundaries, right? How do you make sure, you know, what's acceptable and what's not acceptable? And the same hug that you mentioned that you can provide, if I would provide that to, let's say, a young, staff member, it would put me into great danger, and it would put the person into maybe an uncomfortable situation, and it would be misinterpreted. So once we open up the gates, so to speak, for what we really want, we need to simultaneously manage it with safety and thoughtfulness. And we're kind of in a new territory, but that's not therapy. That's really and that's why I believe, and then I'll be done, that we need something in between the kind of environmental, staff, culture, climate, and the individualized therapy, both of those are necessary. I think what we need is to teach people, similar to when we talk about the science of learning and development, I think we have a science of resiliency and thriving. And we need to, I think, train, retrain, or train all the adults who work with young people in what it is that we mean by resiliency and what it means to engage in resiliency, building activities that strengthen the person. And that's kind of on my agenda now, to figure out, well, what are those building blocks? What do people need to know so we can upgrade the knowledge of youth workers without, in very active, co-constructed ways, because they have a lot of the wisdom, but in a way that actually makes them not therapists, but also makes them not shy away from the things that kids or people around them are experiencing and suffering, right? We don't want them to get too involved and say, oh, I can do this. It's like the hygienist becoming the dentist. We don't want that. But we also don't want the opposite, where they say, well, that's not for me. That's not my territory, because the kid is there and they have a relationship with that child.
Thank you all. One last call here for anybody, any of the attendees to type in, write a comment, ask a question.
We want to hear from you.
Yes, we
I'll
do.
just make a quick pitch while people think about raising their hand, which is to what you just spoke to, Gil, is, if you're working in schools and school districts, look at partnering with the psychiatric social workers who are in those schools. A few years ago, when we started that at LA's Best, I was really reluctant because I was afraid it was going to be too bureaucratic, and I was afraid it was going to be too medical of an approach. I'm really aware of how many kids in our programs are overdiagnosed relative to their more affluent peers and over-prescribed medication. And I found in LAUSD, at least, that the psychiatric social workers are incredibly progressive and holistic thinkers. And shout out to Pia Escudero and Joel Cisneros and LAUSD for being really amazing partners with expanded learning programs. And they're spread thin. There's not enough of them, but they're getting a lot more funding in recent years. And they see the potential of partnering with expanded learning because, like you said, we're not trying to get through all this curriculum. We have some time and space. We already have a focus on relationships. So the partnership potential between mental health, especially school district mental health that already exists, and after school is really great.
Right. I agree. And we should really talk more about this. There's so many ideas, and I really shout out to both of your organizations that are presenting today. All three, also Ren's organization. I think that you are leading in this approach of trauma sensitivity and really openness towards the topics we're discussing. I just wanted to do one thing to show you, for those of you who are interested in continuing to potentially work with us or to start working with us, I will be shameless in saying here are our offerings, which are usually 3 workshops, and one is addressing the youth mental health crisis, building relationships and belonging, educator wellness, and developmental resiliency. So these are all, certificate-based programs, and I would love to talk to any of you who are interested, or go to the PEAR website, which is pearinc.org. And I want to say one last thing, which we didn't get to, but it's important to me. I think, there's a paradox that we can easily say, well, we want to build relationships, and evidence and numbers is really are in the way. But I have despite being kind of humanistic and really being more interested in the actual relationships and connection and resiliency, we have been very struck with when you have student voice and you provide students with the opportunity to actually fill out a form, a questionnaire. And there are a bunch of different approaches now. We started ours, the holistic student assessment, over 20 years ago. And I've been really struck with how when you get 15 or 20 minutes of a student's time, let's say in after school or in school, these are, 500 kids, like of a middle school, and you really can see where are they in the tiers. In this case, there are more kids on tier 2 and tier 3. You can see the averages of strengths versus challenges, and you can then look down very concretely at what are the kids telling. So in this case, for example, 34% of the young people say they have a problem with perseverance and their academic motivation is low. And only 24% of the kids say, or 20% say they have a strength in empathy. So you can actually, the things we're talking about, the kind of precision again of the dentistry approach. I mean, if we can get youth development both to retain its soul, but simultaneously get more into figuring out who is in my program, what are they telling me, how can I actually use this in the beginning of the school year to already make differences in the programming, because you can get this back within a day or two. I really think we have to do more of that if we want to have early detection, because we really give kids a chance, and then we can compare that to national norms. And, it shouldn't get between us like often assessments do in schools. But if we use it as quality improvement and support, we really can get quite far.
Well, thank you so much. Appreciate your wisdom, appreciate all of the work you've done, Gil, and I know that people will be interested in accessing your slides, if you can make those available. Sure. Great.
Yes, this is the way you can be in touch. And this, how do I make the slides available? By sending them to you?
That's right.
Okay.
We'll get them to everyone.
Okay, sure.
Thank you all out there for attending here in the San Francisco Bay Area. It's a rainy, hailing, and thunderstormy day. So I'm glad the power stayed on. We want to let you know that you can visit the How Kids Learn YouTube channel. You can watch past webinars, and you can share those webinars with your staff. Just a reminder that next week on January 18th, we're going to have a webinar with Sherry Glukoff Wong on addressing challenging behavior, a good follow-up to this webinar. And on January 23rd, we'll have a webinar on promoting kindness in the after school with Stu Semigren.
Nice.
Yeah, so thanks again. Appreciate having you on. Hope you all are happy, healthy, and safe out there.
Thank you for having us.